Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the first Congo panel entitled "The Economic Stakes Behind Congo, Africa's World War." I should just say I've been promoted on there. I'm not a professor, although I wish I was. I should just say a very brief thanks to Professor Achebe and to the organisers for inviting me. It's a very great honour to be here, and a great honour to be sharing a platform with such a distinguished panel to discuss a hugely important issue. We saw it come out in the discussion following that last speech, that the issue of the economics behind Congo's conflicts have come to the fore, particularly in NGO media and policy discourse. A note on the format. We've decided to share the format of the first two panels this morning, so each of the panelists will get 5 minutes, although I'll do my best to keep them to that, to give their initial thoughts on the issues. We'll then go into a sort of brief roundtable, and each of the panelists will have a chance to respond, and then open it out to questions and answers from the floor. A quick note on the scope. The title refers to Africa's World War, which is what the War of 98 to 2003 has come to be referred to. We decided that it would be better to open it out from that to a wider historical scope and to the events to the present. So without further ado, I'll pass over to the panelists, and we'll take the speeches in order of the agenda. So first is Mbaya Kankwenda, who's the Executive Director of the Canadian Institute for Development Research and Strategic Studies on Africa.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me, ladies and gentlemen, try to throw 3 or 4 categories of issues. And I think that would be a good starting point, at least from my point of view. And I will throw these 4 issues in line with our moderator's suggestions, although I may go a bit beyond that. The first point is about the configuration of the Central Africa region. The Central Africa region is between the north and the south, east and west of the continent. That means it's a strategically important region for any work in terms of Africa development or Africa integration. Nothing can be done over that region. It is strategically important also for the control, if I can say so, of the future of the continent. It has, you can find these figures in this book for those who know it. It has it had at that time 8 oil-producing countries out of 9 in sub-Saharan Africa. Now it is almost 8 out of 11 or so. It represents 60 to 65% of the solid minerals in the continent. 75% of rainforests. It is the second ecosystem in the world. 80% of fresh water in the continent. And as I said, this is geostrategically important. But at the heart of that region, you have DRC, where there is a concentration of this wealth. And then we had conflict. People start thinking that conflicts are only because of that. And I'll try to answer our modest question. Yes, but economic stakes have been fueling the conflicts for its escalation, for its expansion, but they are not the true cause of the conflicts. They are an important factor in fueling the escalation of the conflict. That's my first point. The second, that based on the centrality of DRC in these, there is a problem that the the competition on the geostrategic side of the work, or of that region, the competition between external powers And people may know that ideas of balkanization of the country are still around. People know, again, that in this line, the United States have been pushing in reconfiguring the geopolitics of that region. And that is behind also this, because some of the conflicts are of that. It happens that DRC, if you look at the Africa map, on its northwest side or boundary, you find the former French colonial empire. On eastern part, the former British colonial empire, which is becoming more and more Anglo-American zone of influence. In the south, you have another former British colonial empire, which is becoming more and more Anglo-American and even South African zone of influence. And the masters of these three zones of influence, not only they try to consolidate their interests, their stakes in their respective areas, but they try to go to the central area where you find, of course, Angola and DRC. And it happens, fortunately or unfortunately, that these two countries were colonized by countries, European countries, that don't have any political weight, any economic weight, or military weight. So they become a field for such a competition. That's an important thing. Behind the scene of these criminal networks, although they have the support of their countries or their governments, despite some of the role played by their proxies in the region. And finally, I see Ms. Chairman, you are telling me that I have to stop somewhere. Thanks, Prof. There is a question that the moderator raised, saying, is there any way, because these issues have been discussed, are being discussed by external voices. They are voiced by external powers or external forces. But how do we get business and political elite, Congolese business and political elite, voice their concern on not national, at both national and you said local, I would say at national and international level. I think, and I'll be a bit provocative on that, the only way for them to get that known is to raise, to stand up, and to mobilize their people. It should be through people's action, strong action, saying enough is enough. For you guys from outside, for you guys with your proxies around, to impose on us your kind of leadership, to impose on us your rule in terms of economic governance, in terms of political governance, even including in social countries. We have to stand and say that by raising the mass movements and supporting and even leading them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll move straight on to our second speaker, who's Tatiana Carayannis, who's the Deputy Director of Conflict and Prevention Peace Forum, the Social Science Research Council. So, Tatiana.
Thank you, Ben. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, and so I apologize in advance for the gruff voice. Let me begin by quoting from last December's report of the UN Independent Group of Experts on sanctions on DRC. Minerals and arms smuggling worth millions of dollars persist in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo despite international sanctions, fueling rebel strength despite national army operations, and army and rebel soldiers continue to kill civilians. And we know that the Congo has long been preyed upon by both external and domestic actors for its riches, from the slave trade to King Leopold's deadly rubber trade, from the Cold War scramble for key strategic minerals, of which Professor Kankwenda spoke, to the resource exploitation of the three recent Congo wars. And as we've seen in countless international reports, a number of Congo's neighbors, in particular Rwanda and Uganda, but others as well, dozens of international corporations, offshore financial centers, and global markets have been complicit in perpetuating the economies of Congo's recent wars. These frequently have been the key nodes in networks that supply goods and services and that provide market outlets to warring government authorities, rebels, and warlords. Without them, many of those fighting in the Congo wars would otherwise have neither the foreign capital to finance a war nor the profit incentive to sustain one. So the exploitation of natural resources and civilians has become the principal means for financing wars in a capital-scarce environment no longer defined by major sponsorship, as we've seen since the end of the Cold War. It's not surprising, then, that the Congo wars have come to be seen as the prototypical resource wars, where proponents suggest that the conflict has been fueled entirely by economic motivations and where profit motive supersedes the goal of military victory. So much of the discourse around the Congo wars is now focused on the economic functions of violence and the economic agendas of actors, particularly non-state actors, to the exclusion of political grievances against the state or rival groups. This, I believe, and here I'll echo Professor Kankwenda's comments, merits some debate and I think requires some greater nuance. What we've come to know now as the greed versus grievance debate has helped move the debate away from what we used to think of as the irrationality or the senselessness of war, and highlighted, in fact, important and previously missing elements in these wars by drawing attention to economic interests and the political economies of modern warfare. Yet, it has since swung us to yet another extreme by overemphasizing economic explanations of violence and the political economy of war. So how does this help us better understand the dynamics of war in the Congo? I suggest it's actually created some degree of confusion. The discursive emphasis on greed over grievance assumes that those who employ violence to challenge the state are motivated solely by personal enrichment rather than any political agenda. This emphasis, I would argue, offers only partial explanations to what we've seen happen in the Congo, as it looks at only one, albeit an important, activity during the war, resource exploitation. Now, this argument and this emphasis or overemphasis fails to distinguish between resource exploitation as the initial cause of war and resource exploitation as the sustaining factor of war. In other words, economic factors as a means to a political end or as an end in itself. In Congo, we've actually seen both. It also fails to distinguish between so-called legal and illicit resource exploitation. You know, we often think of resource exploitation as only being illicit. But how do we account for the behavior of national political elites in what has become an institutionalized system of resource exploitation? The overemphasis on economic factors also suggests that there's no legitimate political grievance in the Congo, and that is, in fact, not so. So if we take the first Congo War, while Laurent Kabila's fighters were comprised largely of foreigners, and as he met with foreign mining companies in the bush during his initial push to Kinshasa, as one of the earlier illustrations of what we've now come to call booty futures, were the tens of thousands of Congolese who supported that offensive, which resulted in Mobutu's ouster, motivated by personal enrichment? Or during the Second War, when Bemba's Ugandan-trained MLC army, financed partly through the exploitation of timber and to some degree the diamond trade, when they entered Equateur in September 1998, was the local population that received them initially as an army of liberation against the occupying Chadian forces motivated by greed? Today, few casual observers would disagree that the offshore drilling blocks in dispute between Angola and the Congo are located in Congolese waters off the coast of Bakongo. Thanks. But does that mean that Bundu Dia Congo's grievances are motivated by economic factors? So I'd like to just start our conversation about this very large topic by suggesting that while the Greek thesis may be accurate in explaining some dynamics in the Congo, if we look at FDLR practices, CNDP practices perhaps in the Kivus, it's an important, and even then I would suggest that if we look at FDLR, there's a political project as well as a very, very aggressive economic motivation. So I'll conclude with my overarching, I guess it's a cautionary note to start our discussion, that economic interests and economic explanations are important, very important, but insufficient explanations of what I think is a rich and complex society and an equally complex structure of violence. Thanks.
Thank you. Moving on to our third speaker, who is Professor Mazrui, who is the Albert Schweitzer Professor in the Humanities and Director of the Institute of Global Cultural Studies at the State University of New York at Binghamton. Professor Mazrui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My sub-agenda here, I will need the help in discussion, especially from my fellow Africans who are studying African culture, because I'm going to say something particularly controversial, that it is true that rape is not part of African culture, and exploiting women in that manner is alien to African civilian culture. I want to make a distinction between African civilian culture and African military culture. It is not true that rape is not part of African military culture. In other words, we are in denial when we say our soldiers don't move in the direction of sexually exploiting women. Now, it's linked to African traditional culture, not by using women as weapons, but as using women as loot, as plunder in warfare. So among the things you capture land, you capture cattle, you capture women as well. And until we recognize that we need to address military training in Africa, in order to deal with the rape issue, we need to address military training, because our soldiers have inherited what used to be a way of capturing additional wives, and therefore have lots of additional responsibilities once you take them home, to capturing women just for brief sexual satisfaction, and then either let them go or abuse them in other ways physically. So I'm making a plea that we should stop being in denial that our soldiers, when they perpetrate these actions, has nothing to do with their role as African soldiers. It's nothing to do with African civilian culture. It's everything to do with African military culture. And when I lived in Uganda for 10 years, and we had once or twice, on one occasion, soldiers came, helped themselves to a couple of women in a hall of residence of students, girls, and took them away. The next day in our home, my wife and I suddenly, just before sunset, a couple of women came and they sat down. We said, this is surprising for students to come at 6 p.m. And then before long, more and more women came because they had turned our home into an asylum from potential sexual abuse in their hall of residence on campus in Uganda. And then I called the vice chancellor, who was himself a Ugandan. Unfortunately, much later he was murdered, so there are a lot of other problems in the country. I called the Vice Chancellor and said, look, I have a substantial number of our women students. We were not expecting them, and they've just come, and before long, they didn't say anything, and then it was clear they had no intention of leaving our house. They had come because they thought our home was bound to grant them asylum, and my wife and I did whatever we could to get pillows and whatnot to make them comfortable, but I said, who's protecting the remaining women in the hall of residence? It was called Mary Stewart. Mary Stewart. Who's protecting the remaining women in the hall of residence? I said to Vice Chancellor Kalimuzo. So he got in touch with the president's office, President Amin, and he then called me to say, Amin promised to send his choicest soldiers to go and protect the students. These are students. So we are in denial. We are not in denial when we say that rape is not part of African culture. That's correct. It's not. And then exploiting women in this particular manner is not part of African civilian culture. But to say that exploiting women sexually is not part of African military culture, we are in denial. That's not true. I've encountered things time on it. Is it uniquely African? No. In fact, I wish I had time to ask a question with regard to the Vietnam War. Per head of population, there were more rapes committed by Western soldiers in Vietnam than were committed by Vietnamese soldiers against adversarial fellow Vietnamese across the border. In other words, Western soldiers, it was almost more part of American military culture when they are fighting in the Orient to help themselves to women than was the case with the Vietnamese fighting each other in the Vietnam War, and they were fighting each other. Additional point to bear in mind is the distinction between using women as infrastructure for the military rather than a weapon against the enemy. And I hope this example of the Japanese who use Korean commodities, they call them comfort women, as if you are buying a drink or a beer. And they actually use the Korean women under their occupation as comfort women for their soldiers. So a different form of sexual exploitation. You are not using it as a weapon against the enemy. You are using them as an additional resource for your own soldiers and participating in that. And this we should bear in mind that there are multiple ways in which our mothers and our sisters have been exploited. And I hope the Japanese version of capturing women and of another community and say, these are our comfort women for our soldiers. And I wasn't able to raise the question whether that form of sexual exploitation has died altogether. Finally, I know there's a hard problem with time, and that is whether civilian culture in the particular country of the Congo is at risk because the country never had a chance to become a proper society in its present boundaries. I mentioned in the earlier section that Margaret Thatcher's argument there's no such thing as society was ridiculous when she was Prime Minister of Great Britain, one of the most integrated societies in the world. But if she had said there's no such thing as Congolese society, then there would be some support for him. Now, because the country never managed to even start the proper process of national integration since independence. Within a couple of weeks of gaining independence, soldiers mutinied. Then before long, the Prime Minister and the President Kasavubu and Lumumba were quarreling with each other. Before additional period, the secession of Katanga under Moise Tshombe was endangering the national boundaries of the society. And before long, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And as if that wasn't enough, We don't know for certain whether there was sabotage, but the death of Dag Hammarskjöld in an air crash not long after that has remained one of the big question marks of the first Congo crisis. Was it an accident? Was it some kind of sabotage? And at the time it happened in 1961, there was also the concern of whether Dag Hammarskjöld, in fact, in a disturbed mind, arranged for the plane to air crash. I personally don't believe that, but there was a lot in his book, published at the time, with phrases like, "Do I fear in me a capacity to be so destroyed, tired and lonely, so tired the heart aches." This is Dag Hammarskjöld almost in his last days, in his jottings, the book he published at the time. So my last fear is this, because our beloved Congo, which is one of our most precious countries, has never had a chance to become even a society, let alone a stable state. It might erode the disciplines of protecting our women. Until now, the risk has been that our soldiers are not trained enough to respect women. I fear that if we don't do enough to stabilize our country, the Congo, even the civilian protective attitude to our women may be at risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's, I don't know if it's heartening or not to know that no matter how far I go from the UK, you can't escape references to Margaret Thatcher. Moving on to our second to last speaker, Alafuele Kalala, who's a former Democratic Republic of Congo presidential candidate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just take 1 minute to make a comment on the pertinent point that Professor Mazrui has just made. The distinction between civilian and army culture in Africa. I explained the behavior of the army in Africa not as a cultural extension of the capture of women to make several wives, but as an extension of its nature as colonial army. Colonial armies in everywhere, colonial armies in Africa behaved as occupation armies. And an occupation army, throughout the history of the world, does not just occupy the land, it takes everything and it rapes women. Sexual violence is part of the occupation, and Professor Mazrui himself has given several examples, most recent examples. It happened in Europe during the First World War, the Second World War. It happened in Yugoslavia. It happens everywhere. So I made this point in 1993 in a slim volume in which I was trying to explain the essence of the Mobutu regime. Because if we don't change the nature of armies in Africa, we will not be able to really democratize African societies. But that's another point of discussion. Let me just now, I would like first, before making a few points on the topic, extend my best wishes, my birthday wishes to Professor Achebe for his 80th birthday. The subject of the economic stakes behind Congo First World War is a very complex one. So since I've been given just, and we're given just 5 minutes, and I'm going to try to simplify the work of our moderator, I have summarized my intervention in 3 points, just to try to get to you what I consider, I may be mistaken, to be the essence of the economic stakes behind all the various conflicts in the Congo. I am going to stick to this point so that I don't go beyond the 5 minutes, but I would enjoy any discussion on this point. The first point that I want to put to your consideration is that since its founding as a quasi-modern state at the Berlin Conference in 1885, the political history of Congo appears to have been an offshoot story of the exploitation of its vast natural wealth for and by outside interests, with a ghastly toll among its native population and on its standard of living. The products have somehow changed, the products of exploitation. They have changed with the evolving dynamics of the world economy. It was rubber and ivory, among others, in Leopoldian Congo. It is largely coltan, gold, diamond, cobalt, copper, cassiterite, you name it, in present-day Congo. It could be more or less the same tomorrow, or it could be oil, gas, or something else. But the pattern and the unspeakable brutality remain nearly unchanged. For over 120 years, the people of Congo have suffered much, much more than they have ever benefited from the natural riches of their country. And this is why I have been constantly holding that the wealth of the Congo is a curse for the people of the Congo. I don't want to expand the theme of the panel. I would like just to suggest that we put the issue of the economic stakes behind Congo, Africa's or first war, we put the issue in the proper historical perspective. In my opinion, and I may be mistaken, the major difference between then and now is the change in the nature of the culprits. Up to 1996, the pilfering of Congo's rich was essentially the work of non-Africans. Indeed, what the ADFL did was to allow a good number of non-Congolese Africans to discover the unprotected and uncared for hidden house of treasure that Europeans had kept to and for themselves for over a century. What else could they, these non-Congolese Africans, do? What else could they have done other than join in the loot? And to looting they went in any and every possible way. The second point that I put to your consideration is that thus, even if it can be very well argued that the onset of the 1996 war had at its core genuine political and security concerns for the major parties that were involved, and apart from the somehow objective, I take a historical perspective, and apart from the somehow objective necessity of exploiting conquered territories to fund the continued prosecution of war, the advantage is that the opportunity to loot offered to individuals, to groups, to the various factions, and even to governments involved, subverted not only the motives of the conflict, I am using the singular plural, but also it subverted the way in which it was and is being prosecuted. All those who benefited from the conflict acquired a vast interest in its continuation. Confidential reports have established that some went even to the extent of creating or strengthening their enemies or avoiding their total annihilation. Conflict in the Congo is a highly lucrative business, not only for arms dealers, but also for several other parties. Extensive networks were established not for the prosecution of war, but in order to set up systems of effective looting. This has over time led to a real criminalization of the Congolese economy, which will remain a serious challenge for the people of the Congo and its government, even well after the conflict will have ended. Evidently, that's the third point that I want and the final one to put to your consideration. The continued interference of many a foreign player in the political life of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with each endeavoring to having in power in the Congo individuals or groups most prone to defend its interests, and I mean by that, to allow its continued loot of the Congo, dim is the hope for any real and substantial change in the near future. Needless to say that no policies, local or international, however well-intentioned they may be, can really help a stateless society, and I liked what Professor Mazrui said, Congo never became a society, and I said, perhaps we should speak about a society less territory. So nothing can really help a stateless society or a society less territory, a society in which rulers are more accountable to competing external forces and interests than to the legitimate concerns of the citizenry. I may be mistaken, but so far, the history of the Congo has not belied this fact. For the last 50 years or so, Congo has been on a declining path in spite of well-intentioned international efforts and policy measures in its favor, and in spite of the billions of dollars in foreign aid that have been thrown at it. So far, Congo has behaved and continues to behave as a bottomless pit. Thank you, and I will appreciate the discussion.
Thank you very much. And we'll move swiftly on to our final speaker, last but certainly not least, Professor Edouard Bustin, who is Professor of Political Science at Boston University.
Is this working? Yes, I guess. First, let me thank Professor Achebe, as well as the other authorities at Brown University that have made this colloquium possible. Much as I expected or feared, several of the points that I had planned to make have been raised by several of my fellow panelists, which is not surprising considering that, of course, we're all dealing with the same topic. And I'd like to address some of the points that have been raised, perhaps adding a caveat or a corrective here and there. The business of resources and stakes, economic stakes that are mentioned in the title of the panel, are one of those terms that is sort of bandied around and perhaps not fully explained, because the stakes are obviously different depending on the actors that you're talking about, whether it's a state or quasi-state actor, or whether we're talking about individuals, the stakes are obviously different. The economic issues or the economic stakes for a peasant family in Kivu, for instance, or in Ituri are quite different from those for the government of Rwanda or for a major multinational mining corporation. And this is only to be expected, of course. By the same token, the prolific literature on greed and grievance often seems to establish some sort of a contrast between the two. It's either greed or grievance, but in many cases, of course, grievance and what might be called economic motivation, let's call it greed if you will, have a way of blending. Again, shall we say, for a peasant family in the Kivus that has seen their land being appropriated to various schemes, shall we say, by immigrants is a very different matter. And so the establishment of a dividing line between greed and grievance may in fact not be all that relevant. It's true, as several of the fellow panelists have mentioned, that the Congo has always been a rich cake, if you will, that sort of attracted the appetites of a number of outsiders, starting with King Leopold, but continuing throughout the colonial period, but then continuing, of course, under Mobutu in a variety of ways during the last years of the Mobutu period, when Mobutu had pretty much been given up as irrelevant, if you will, by its Western backers, especially the United States. At the end of the Cold War, Mobutu resorted to a practice which has now, in effect, shall we say, in a different way, different guises, become more common, namely, in effect, farming out entire sections of the country to some of his retainers, like General Baramoto, for instance, to mention only one case. And corporations, of course, have always been active, directly or indirectly, in the politics of the Congo. I only have to remind you of the Katanga secession, in which the then mining giant Union Minière was heavily involved, even though initially, of course, the Union Minière and other Belgian interests had looked toward the decolonization process as one that would almost inevitably lead to a new form, to a form of neocolonialism, whereby, in effect, their interests would be protected. The issues that are involved here in terms of outside intervention in the Congo's affairs have perhaps a special dimension or a special flavor, if you will, given what might be called the black legend that has surrounded the Congo. Conrad is to blame, I'm afraid, for establishing this image as a heart of darkness, which has been sort of haunting people who write about the Congo, often from a distance, as a matter of fact, and who sort of blandly and very dismissively feel that the Congo should not exist. In fact, there is a sort of long generation, shall we say, of sort of rather sensationalist articles or pieces of work that have claimed way back in 1960, at the time of the Katanga secession, a French writer was claiming that the Congo should be simply dismembered and merged into the Franco-African family. The same sort of theme keeps reoccurring here and there, and I notice that my colleague, Jeffrey Herbst, with a fellow co-writer, has recently penned an article in Foreign Policy in which he says, well, the Congo does not exist. Try to get this across your mind. There's no such thing as a Congo. Well, I beg to differ, and if you ask any Congolese, no matter what side of the fence they're on, I think there's one thing on which all of them would agree, namely that there is a Congo and there is a Congolese identity, of which they are, by and large, and perhaps intermittently, proud. Now, the matter of the looting of the Congo's resources is, again, an old story. I'm not referring here to what might be called the legitimate looting of the Congo's resources by the colonial power and assorted corporate entities that were linked with it in a very almost incestuous way, you know, through the Comité du Katanga, for instance. But I'm referring to what has been taking place over the past 15 years or so, if you will, beginning with the end of the Mobutu regime and the episodes that have been mentioned earlier, playing with the concessions that were being bandied around by Kabila Sr. to various minor mining companies, so-called the miners as opposed to the majors, you see what I mean. But literally, the topic has been covered quite extensively, almost from the very beginning with NGOs like Global Witness, say, for instance, and quite a few others, but also in UN reports on the pillage or looting of the Congo's resources, again, going back several years, more recently with the report that has just been mentioned by Dr. Carayannis, the UN Security Council expert group report, the final report that was released just a couple of days ago, the mapping report that was released in an, shall we say, modified or somewhat mitigated form to avoid pointing too directly at the responsibility of actors such as Rwanda, et cetera, et cetera. So in a number of ways, the issue is not new, and the issue has been recognized, which makes you wonder why not more has been done to address it. The US Congress has recently tackled the issue of conflict minerals and tried to establish some sort of rule whereby the source of such minerals as coltan, for instance, would have to be sort of verified. We've been there before with the Kimberley process, and we know that this is not a foolproof way of addressing the issue. There are more significant ways to deal with the issues, and the next panel, well, one of the next two panels will, I think, address the issue of, shall we say, what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to all for keeping so wonderfully to time. I'm very pleased you also raised that issue of what can be done, because it's something that I find personally fascinating. What I think we'll do now is give the panelists a chance to respond to any issues that have been brought up by the contributions of others. We can try and make that relatively brief, and then we'll go into an open discussion, take questions and comments from the floor, because I know there'll be an awful lot of opinion on these issues, and it'd be great to get a conversation going. So perhaps if we go in the same order as we did for the contributions, just for some final thoughts or reactions. So turning first to Mbaya.
Some comments on...
Well, just reactions or thoughts that have been brought up by the other contributions.
Thank you. I'd like to highlight maybe 2 or 3 things. One is that the Congo, since its beginning as a state, what was called the so-called Congo independent state, there was in its kind of constitution, if I can call so, the idea of recognizing not only that it was a personal property of King Leopold II or II, but most importantly, it was an area that is open and should remain open to any international trade, navigation, and so on and so forth. That dimension has affected the whole life of this country. Everything that has an important political or strategic stake in the Congo becomes an international issue, minimizing what the people of that country want to become or to do. And that's what is continuing now. Second, although it was recognized as King Leopold II property, and then the heritage from to Belgium. But all these countries that accepted as a rule of the game at that time in 1885 were always looking on that, trying to get something from that rich cake, as he put it. But now that the Belgians are officially out, and they don't have the weight to resist to France, United States, or the UK ambition toward that country. That's part of how, I would say, what is happening there may not have happened in an old or a former British colony, or even in France, former colony. The case of Côte d'Ivoire, especially because France itself is involved. It is because of that, not only because we are rich, we are endowed with all these resources. This is because people think that. And third, the strategic thinking about that country, including its geostrategic position in Africa, if not in the world, unfortunately is out of not only Congo, but even out of Africa. If we do not have that in mind, any discussion we may have may not conclude with the strategic recommendations we may expect from such a gathering or from any other undertaking we have from other fora or from other groups we are fighting in. So I just want to highlight these 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Tatiana.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate something that Professor Bustin mentioned, and that is the strength of Congolese national identity. And I never thought that I would that I would be defending this from Congolese colleagues saying that Congo has no is a state without a society. Usually, we call it a society that's rather stateless. But let me assure you that the Congolese have a very, very strong national identity. There are a number of you here, and perhaps you can corroborate this. It is why it is also so anathema to Congolese when external actors bandy about this idea that Congo perhaps is too big to govern and should be carved up. Like most societies, identity is multifaceted. It's complicated. Like many of us who share various identities at any given moment, so do the Congolese. They may at times disagree with one another internally, but when it comes to an external, either to external aggression or to external factors and actors, there is very much a Congo, there is very much a Congolese society, and there's a very, very strong sense of national identity, of being Congolese, of being part. And this is despite the failure and the absence of the state for the last 60 years.
Thank you. Professor Mazrui.
First, a point of partial concession to Professor Kalala with regard to whether the incidence of rape by African soldiers is a product of the colonial origins of current armies in Africa, as distinct from my assertion that it is a distortion of a longer established tradition of treating women as possible loot in a war. It's a kind of commodification of women. And I think that the two interpretations are compatible with each other, and they may both be true, that there is a longer tradition of treating women as loot in a war, and then you create an army under colonial conditions, and it has consequences. Just if you forgive my memory once again, I was just a child during World War II, and in Mombasa, which is Kenya's main port, there were some African soldiers coming in from Ghana and from South Africa, intended in part to oust the Italians from the Horn of Africa and in part to fight in Burma. One of the things I remember about that is how terrified our women were of those Ghanaian and at that time they were called Gold Coast and South African soldiers. And many of our women were Muslim and normally would be covering themselves. And the sight of Africans in uniform, they knew these are Gold Coasters or South Africans, and they were terrified of being humiliated or raped at that time. So this is one of the memories. That's why I'm so keen we should recognize what we are at the moment in denial about, that there's something wrong with our military culture in Africa. And then with Professor Tatiana, I like this idea of the Second Congo War as a world war, but I think, like the world as a whole, Congo has had 2 world wars. Yeah, both major wars, world wars. The first Congolese World War, beginning almost immediately in 1960, included globalized the Cold War, competition between the USA and USSR for control within the Congo, the tendency to globalize the significance of the disagreement between Lumumba and Kasavubu at that time, and then the globalized United Nations intervention in the Congo at that time, and the coming in of Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the greatest of the Secretaries General of the United Nations, who then paid with his life after one of the missions to Katanga at that time. So there were, but it is true that the First World War of the Congo had a disproportionate foreign participation, with including the superpowers engaged on one side in fragmenting the Congo and on the other in defending its territorial integrity. The globalization of this second war included use of United Nations peacekeepers, globalized also by intercontinental plunder economically, globalized because of the commodification of women and crimes against humanity, and pan-Africanized by inter-African civilian plunder by neighbors, and pan-Africanized by neighboring armies occupying territory within that. So this country has become not just a paradigm of either a failed state or a failed society, but it has become the regionalization of world conflicts in one single country. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Kalala?
Yeah, thank you. I would like just first to give an example to support what Professor Mazrui just said about the culture of the army. In 1960, nearly from 1960 to 1965, we had various civil wars in the Congo, and I was already of a certain age to witness some events, and I remember that it was considered quasi-normal that the military, when they came, they would try to rape women, and women were generally terrified. That's a fact. I would like just to say, from what Professor Bustin said, I don't know, okay, perhaps it's a way of putting it, when he spoke about legitimate looting of the Congo. In my opinion, there is no such thing as legitimate looting. Either it's looting or
I should have used quotation marks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, perhaps Professor Carayannis did not understand well. I did not dispute the existence of Congolese identity, and in fact, I argued with American officials during the ADFL War, 1996 to 1997. The prevalent thought in Washington was that Congo was going to explode and disintegrate. I told them that Congo will not disintegrate because there is indeed a real Congolese identity, which is much stronger than the state. But we have to recognize that for all practical purposes, Congo is a stateless society. And for one time that I agreed with the former Herman Cohen, it was when he stated in the United States Congress, I think it was in 1993, that to say that Congo is a state, for all practical purposes, it will be an overstatement, at least. 1993. Congo is not too big to govern. The problem is that Congo has not been given the chance to govern. I have tried to summarize the problem of the Congo in one sentence. I say that the problem of the Congo is that since its founding, its foundation as a quasi, I prefer to use the term quasi-modern state, the affairs of the Congo have not been the affair of the people of the Congo. That's the problem. But I don't think, and I had a discussion yesterday with Professor Herbert White, I have heard this, and I was in the parliament. People saying that Congolese cannot govern themselves, or that they cannot manage a modern legislature. My feeling, and I've been involved with the politics of the Congo for nearly 40 years, you will always find that there is an external hand that tries not to allow Congolese to deal with their own issues and to get Congo to work. You have highly educated people in the Congo. Traditional societies, and I hold this, I say, because we discussed about democracy this morning, traditional African traditional societies were democratic societies. We can debate on that. In my opinion, ethnicity in itself is not the problem in Africa. The problem is when supposedly political leaders, and I have said in the Congo, technically, we don't have political leaders for one reason. What I have studied, and political scientists may belie me, is that a leader is the emanation of a group, and it represents a group. What we have in the Congo, and I am not ashamed to say it, are the people who represent themselves, but are using ethnicity as a way of manipulating the people. And I think that to some extent that's an issue throughout Africa. But behind them, and in fact what they are trying to do, they are using what the colonial masters did in Africa. They manipulated ethnicity, and they said, they use what Romans said, divide and rule. It has said that it was said by Churchill. Romans said divide and rule. I told people what they don't understand is really the political, is a political tool. What they did not understand is that when Romans said that, they use it outside Rome, not inside Rome. So you cannot build a society based on trying to divide its members. And that's why, to some extent, there I will perhaps disagree with you and agree with, but it's contentious with Professor Mazrui, because I have said it in the Congo. The whole process, I may say, since the Leopoldian era to the Mobutu regime to present, has made it that we have destroyed the sense of society in the Congo, in the people of the Congo, because we have destroyed the sense of common good. But that we can debate on that.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Bustin.
Well, I don't want to add too much to this sort of second version of the panel, just to remind you that, as I mentioned earlier, the economic stakes in the Congo are different depending on which actor you're talking about. And as far as the Congolese state, such as it is concerned, the matter of revenue from the Congo's exports, from the Congo's resources is vital. In this respect, I noticed that among the various schemes that have been floated here and there, and that fall within the general category of sort of tearing the Congo apart or breaking it up in some form or another, there was a suggestion that perhaps a customs union should be formed between the Congo and its eastern neighbors, such as Rwanda, for instance, and Uganda, through which, as we know, a large percentage of the Congo's mineral export have somehow or other found their way to the benefit of the Rwandan treasury or economy, and Uganda as well. That would obviously be a way for the Congolese state to deprive itself of much needed revenue. On the matter of actors in the Congo, well, Africa's World War, if you will, as we know, there are several African actors that were involved and that were judged in the Western press favorably or unfavorably, depending, in effect, shall we say, or whether we were dealing with the good guys or bad guys according to our nomenclature. And so actors like Zimbabwe, to a certain lesser extent Namibia, for instance, who were looked down upon, Angola too, perhaps, whereas Rwanda and Uganda were regarded favorably, possibly in the aftermath of the vision of a sort of emerging brave new African leaders that were supposed to somehow or other sweep out of the Horn of Africa in places like Eritrea or Ethiopia or Uganda or Rwanda. Maybe even Kabila could be ranked among those. And of course, there's been a reconsideration, shall we say, of this qualification of the various leaders involved. Let me finally mention something which for some reason or other hasn't come up before, and which obviously falls very much within the purview of this panel, namely that there is a new kid on the block in the Congo and Central Africa, in much of Africa, as a matter of fact, and that, of course, is China. The People's Republic of China has sort of made I wouldn't call it necessarily a penetration, but shall we say a significant first step in involving itself in the exploitation / development of the Congo in a way that is not unusual, mind you, and in a way which was noted in one of the several books on China and Africa that are proliferating left and right, was very much the way that another economic superpower behaved vis-à-vis China about a generation ago. And this was when Japan practiced in China the same sort of deal-making, if you will, that we see China now offering to various African countries, including the Congo, with so far promising, albeit maybe mixed, results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks all.